How's it going, everyone? Session here. Welcome back to the Futures Rewritten Theoretical Ultimates presentation. This is going to serve as a part two, if you will, of what it's going to be from the mechanical perspective of the Ultimates in terms of its execution in the current format and what I would have proposed as a theoretical, more difficult version, if you will, to allocate for the difficulty of the Ultimate. So we've already covered the storytelling version of that, which I will put in the description below in case you want to go watch that and get the story idea behind it. And so now we're going to cover the mechanics version. So to make this a little bit easier as well in terms of a time factor, I didn't want to cover every single phase in one giant video. I feel like we'll be here for like 2 hours. And so I wanted to make it a little simpler. And so we'll cover each particular phase. So with the mechanics in mind, here we're going to cover the theory mechanics, particularly for the Fatebreaker. Now, as you know, in terms of preparation for phase one versus Fatebreaker, we always will split up into clock spots and have this particular formation. The first boss mechanic that comes out of the boss is going to be the cyclonic break attack. This is going to be an 8-directional cleave attack that targets each player, and we pretty much want to position ourselves in a way that allows us to spread apart and also create like an 8-sided star, if you will, so we can dodge and adjust the AoEs accordingly and not really clip anybody or get hit by the attacks. Additionally, though, as you know, during this cast attack, the boss is also channeling either the elements of lightning or fire in the current version of the ultimate. Lightning is a spread variation, if you will, so you would spread apart and not clip anybody because obviously you don't want to do that, and that way it works in this kind of format. And then you have the fire version, which is pair stacks, and it'll target either all support or all DPS. Now, in the Savage version and the normal version as well, if you will, there was a light variation that they did not bring into the ultimate, and I think that was like a really big missed opportunity for them to actually apply that into the current version of the ultimate. So I've added that into the ultimate as a result, and so as you will now understand, if you haven't done the Savage version, the light element channeled a wild charge cone attack that targeted strictly the main tank and both healers. The healers will be covered by the DPS in order to ensure their survivability, and in order for the main tank to survive, they would have to be covered by the off tank. So those players that were not hit by the attack would have had to actually dodge the initial hit on those targets and then have to dodge into the second follow-up in order to keep those healers and the main tank alive. And then once that's been resolved, then you would dodge accordingly and get ready for the powder mark tank buster. However, I'm also under the impression, with the storyline in mind, with Metron taking over Shiva and actually channeling the power of Fatebreaker through darkness, if you will, having Metron be like the Asking the darkness in my own concept, I figured that there should have been a dark version element imbued in Fatebreaker to kind of like, harbor that energy in some kind of canonical aspect. So I'm going to say that there should have been 4 elements. Granted, the Savage version had 3. But however, lore-wise, there never was a dark element. So mechanically, it's kind of hard to understand, like, how would you make a dark element? Well, look no further, because I've actually done that. And so if I had created a dark version of Cyclonic Break, it would have been an 8-player mega stack on a random target. In order to actually do this mechanic correctly, you would have had all 8 players get close to under the boss as possible, since you have to be ready for the reaction of which one it could be between 4 elements. If it's lightning, it's spread; if it's fire, it's pairs; if it's light, it's wild charge. But with darkness, you would have had to have everybody get close under the boss. That way, the stack attack could be shared across all 8 players. And yes, should you have had one person out of the mechanic for that stack attack, it would have given all 7 other players Mark of Morality, which is probably the worst debuff you could acquire, where it decreases your damage horrendously. Getting hit by it again will kind of incorporate like a doom thing, so you really just don't want to deal with it, and having Mark of Morality like really sucks. So I think that the punishment for actually not doing that mechanic correctly is very fruitful in this regard, and it does serve as a body check as a result. Now, there's that. Next, as we know, the follow-up with the tank buster being Powder Mark Trial, it's going to target the main tank with the attack. Normally it's invuln through Party Finder, and then the later follow-up will have a delayed tank buster follow-up attack that'll target the closest player to the main target that got hit by the tank buster originally. So Powder Mark Trial does exactly that. Now, I feel like there just should have been a second version. So I created one, and it's called Powdermark Cross. This would be the same exact tank buster concept where it targets the main tank. However, it'll also target the follow-up attack on the farthest player. So unlike having the trial version be very close and have the tank be north and have the off tank be northeast, you would have had the tank be north and south in order to assure that it would cross over and hit the follow-up on the off tank. And then we would have gotten ready for Utopian Sky's elemental charge, with also there being 4 elements. So as we know, with Utopian Sky Lightning, it's a spread with the combo followation of Prismatic Deception and Blasting Zone. It all goes off at the same time. So all the clones will either sword up or sword down. You know, sword down is safe. You go to that safe spot, and then as soon as the attacks go off, the lightning will go spread, and then you have to basically be prepared for the follow-up on that. Now, additionally, there is a fire variation where it's just stacks on the healers, and then you have to follow suit again and make sure that everyone shares that attack, and then prepare yourself for the follow-up as well. There is a light version in this case scenario, and it would have been invisible puddles that drop and explode after Prismatic Deception. So unlike the situation that we have with the lightning spread, and you'll also notice that lightning is got a lot of execution similarities to light, and fire has a lot of similarities to dark, just so that way we're not being over encumbered by the wide variety of mechanics, but at least you to be attentive enough to understand how to respond to certain mechanic follow-ups. So the light version would have been invisible puddles that we have already experienced in the Savage and even the normal version, and they would have just had been applied in the same function here. And yes, you would have been able to have everybody stack under it to make it even a little bit easier to avoid the puddle, and that way you can get prepared for the follow-up as well. Now again, there is never a dark version for what would have been done for this mechanic. So in terms of creating my own version of this, it would have been donuts that will target the healers, and it would explode after the actual blasting zone attacks go off with Prismatic Deception. So the attacks would have happened, there would have been a delay, and then the donuts would have gone off, and then you would have to prepare yourself to get ready for the next cyclonic break during Utopian Sky Part 2. Now, the reason why I wanted to incorporate this in particular is because a lot of players, especially through my experience as a party finder and people trying to figure out how to position themselves very quickly and prepare themselves, it usually requires a lot of players to move very quickly in terms of pre-positioning for the follow-up attack that they have with the attack in mind. I've decided that the donuts would have served a patient, like, wait just 1 second for the thing to go off and play it safe, knowing that you have to get ready for the next follow-up. And I think that donuts would have been a proper example of this, so that way if you did decide to try and dodge if necessary, you could at least be, willing to abide by the mechanical rules that we have allocated for this. And so I thought that donuts would be a great example. Next, the boss will cast another cyclonic break. In this case scenario as well, we have dark, so the party would have gone underneath close to the hitbox. The attack would have gone off, and then you have to start to spread accordingly and get ready for your north and south spots for roll stacks, and then have the final version of Utopian Sky come into place. The difference, however, is that the clone is charging an element, and as you can see, it's white, which implies light. So normally the clone will either charge lightning or fire in the normal variation, and in my example, I have that either the clone and the boss can charge any elements. And what this would imply is, since the north clone was glowing in light, any color that is not light will be the safe spot. So if, in this example, the light circles are there, those are going to be enlarged and therefore be unsafe to stand in when you take the knockback or the follow-up attack for the Bound to Fates. And so the other element, being lightning in this case scenario, would have been the safe side. It could have been fire, it could have been dark, but I just chose lightning as a result. Next, the West clone always has the habit in the normal variation of the mechanic of casting lightning. Always, no questions asked. Wasn't a big fan of that, so I've incorporated the idea of it having a light and dark variant. And the North clone will cover that as well in a moment, but right now, since the dark is being channeled in the West clone, if you're familiar with P11, which is Themis, love that guy, his burst strike attack will do a line AoE and then cover the area that was not hit. So Themis will, in his version of the fight, he'll kind of sweep through and do his attack, and then the outer area beyond where he hit will be attacked with a follow-up. And that same rule of thumb applies here. So you would have to, wait outside the burst strike to actually have the attack go off, and then go under because he covers the outside. And then you would dodge that accordingly. So the North clone in this case scenario, in the normal version, It's always channeling the element of fire, meaning that it's always going to be a knockback. So again, to incorporate the variation in mind, I decided to incorporate light and dark as well for this case scenario. So in this, it's actually going to be light burst strike. And what light burst strike does is the same thing that we saw kind of with Utopian Sky in the beginning. It'll do puddles that'll go under all the players and have to be baited outside in order to prevent it from kind of creating a cluster, if you will, and getting a little bit messy as a result. And you would dodge it accordingly. And during that preparation, the clones are spawning southwest and southeast will tether to 2 random players and will start to prepare Bound of Faith. And in the normal version of this mechanic, it's always fire for both clones. I've decided to be that guy and incorporate any element that's not lightning. So they'll either channel fire, light, or dark. And in this case scenario, they're channeling, one is channeling light and the other one is channeling dark. Just to kind of explain to you what the variation will be, since we already know what fire is, since it's the more commonplace element. Fire, as we know, is a 4-player plus stack, so you can have 5 players, just to kind of allocate the variation as well. The light version is going to put an AoE around a single target that cannot be shared with any other player, and it will do a delayed raid wide after the attack has gone off. This attack was in the Savage and normal version of the fight of the Fatebreaker fight, and so I wanted them to incorporate that into this as well. The dark version, however, is a brand new variation of the element mechanic, and what it will do instead is it will target a player with that's farthest from that particular person with a stack with a single target AoE. So in this case scenario, as you can see, the melee that has the light clone tether will move away from the party just a little bit to kind of have their own space and not clip anybody else with the light's AoE. The rest of the DPS that are not affected by this, since they don't have to be affected, will move away from the DPS with the light clone. The healer in this example has the dark clone, and so what's going to happen is the dark clone targeting the person with the Bound of Faith is not going to be an issue for those who stand near that target. So the healer and tank that are not even dealing with the mechanic, they can just kind of hang out and not worry about the situation. But there is one person that has to be able to bait the dark clone. Now, realistically, it doesn't matter who it is, because that way we don't have this issue of being like an only tanks thing. Any player can particularly take that targeted AoE as long as they are the furthest away. And I think realistically, the issue that come into hand with this is if it was a multi-hitting attack. So if the dark person took the bait but somebody else got hit, then I think that it would understand that and then just give that extra player marker morality, so that you don't have to like get, you don't kind of enforce the idea that anybody can just take it. It should hit one particular person, and that person will have a vulnerability up debuff, and you want to make sure you can avoid that as much as possible. So in this case scenario, that's what that does. Next mechanic after this is a Burnishing Glory AoE, which I think is perfect. There's no reason to touch that mechanic. But after that AoE, the boss starts preparing Fall of Faith, which is probably the hardest mechanic in Phase 1. And Fall of Faith is the exact same mechanic as normal, with the exception of the boss and the 3 clones will use any element at random order. It doesn't matter. So if you want the boss to channel lightning and then all the clones channel lightning also, you can do that. If it's all dark, if it's all light, if it's all fire, if it's like a 2-1-1 pattern, 1-2-1 pattern, 3-1-1, whatever you name it, it's possible. And I think that would have inquired this to be a exceptionally difficult mechanic that would have required people to be very flexible and ready to react at the moment. And I've ensured that it's possible to make this work without having it be unfair, but also still be very challenging, even for a Phase 1 mechanic. So in the case of each tether, as we know, if it is lightning, the target gets lifted with the Bound of Faith, and then the 3 players that are closest in proximity to that will get hit with a wide cone, and they must be spread apart from each other so that they don't clip each other or the party on the other side. The fire version is going to be a stack variation, so all 3 players we need to line up and share the attack without having anybody else get mark morality if it's missed, because if it's less than 3 players, those other 2 players get marked. Not good. Now, with the light version, the light party version will have the player be separated from the rest of the party on their side. And similar situation, you want to make sure that you're isolated just enough to be able to not clip anybody else. And that way you can only have a single delayed raid wide that will affect the party, but it won't be too drastic because it's only one AoE. I feel like if it was more than 2, then it would be pretty dire. But again, with 1 being the most logical one, makes sense for me here. And then Dark, similar situation to the Utopian Sky variation. It will target the farthest player with an AoE, and the exception here is that the baits cannot be a tethered player, obviously because we want to keep them lined up east and west positionally for the actual tethers in mind. So the Dark version here, having it come from the boss first, means that the person that is the fire tether is number 3, so that person cannot take the Dark follow-up. So in this case scenario, just to make it simple, I have the healer be the player that is unbound by a clone and therefore can take the Dark AoE. Now, of course, in a dangerous situation, let's say that it was like a Dark and then lightning, then yes, the person that is Dark taking the bait would need to immediately move and prepare themselves away from the lightning AoE tether, because obviously you don't want to get clipped by that and it'll kill you. Additionally, because the Dark target AoE will give you a magic vulnerability up debuff, you cannot just have one person in the possible case scenario that it is Dark. You can't have all of the Dark attacks go on a singular person. That person will just eventually die. So that way you have to kind of allocate a variational swap, if you will. But I did think it was logical to have it be possible for this mechanic to be the hardest one out of them all, knowing that the variation of each mechanic is the most random. Next mechanic is going to be the Tower Burst Strike, where the boss will channel Burst Strike and then the towers will appear. And there will also be a powder mark tank buster that's placed on the tank at the time. And yes, it will be trial or cross. Trial being closest to the next target, or cross being farthest. And the burst strike casted by the boss will either be lightning, fire, or light. I feel like dark wasn't really appropriate for the mobility and functionality of it, so I didn't want to include it here and kind of be it be over encumbering. So lightning, as you know, is standard. It's a stay out and then don't get clipped by it mechanic. Fire is a go in and get knocked back into the tower, and then light is going to be floor puddles, which I think is a great variation because you would have to bait the floor puddles outside of the tower before actually hopping in the tower. So for some players who move too quickly inside, it would have incorporated like a opportunity to be very mindful of where you're positioning, because the size of the puddle is the same size as the actual tower. So you just want to be careful about how you place that, right? And then it would have required the execution, and the variation of the towers can also swap if it's like a 1-4-1, 2-2-2, 3-1-2, whatever that you want to call it. It's the combination for that is also working in the exact same fashion. And then the buster will go off. Now, in the case of trial, it's up to the tanks to kind of figure out whether they want to stay close to each other or farther from each other. Again, variation comes into play with that too. However, this is not the final mechanic of the actual Enrage. The final Enrage mechanic for the Fatebreaker phase would be called the Cycle of Dread. And this is an ode, if you will, to the Savage version of Fatebreaker, where the boss will channel one particular element and use each primary mechanic. This is exactly the same thing we encountered in the Savage version. So he'll first do Cyclonic Break, and then he'll do a Burst Strike, and then a Bound of Faith. So it'll, in this case example, it's fire. So it's going to be Cyclonic Break into pairs, then he's going to do a Burst Strike into a knockback, and the Bound of Faith will target one player, and then it's going to be a stack. However, the Bound of Faith will just explode and wipe the party instead of it being just like a 4-person stack and then you have to survive the attack. So you have to kill the boss by the time you actually execute the Bound of Faith on the target, and then if not, then it's GG's and you hit the reset. So in my mind, this is the perfect version. It's a better version because it incorporates all of the different elements that are at hand. Perfect might not be the best word, but I think that I would have loved for him to have 4 elements in mind. I think that would have been the most ideal case scenario for it. And so I thought that adding dark and light as an element would have been the most ideal. And so I'm really a little proud for being able to invent mechanics, if you will, but also keeping some things a little bit familiar to what we've already experienced. So adding a dark element, I think, would have been a great addition to the lore implication for the story and also the boss as a whole, because the usage of lightning and fire is great, but I think adding those 2 elements would have also been really fun as well. And so there you have it. We have phase 1 theory mechanics at least in mind for Fatebreaker. It definitely adds a lot of more challenge because of the fact that there's 4 elements to keep in mind of versus 2. And I understand that 2 is already kind of enough, but I think that for an ultimate sake, people want to be ready to always have the adaptability in mind. So I think that adding those 2 elements was exactly what was necessary. And so next time we will go and cover phase 2, if you will, of the ultimate, and that'll be versus the Usurper Frost, which I would say get ready because that's going to be quite the explanation, and I hope you're looking forward to it. So thank you for watching and tuning in. I appreciate it. And of course, I will see you in the next one. Take care.